I had a preacher friend in my home church in Kansas who liked to say, it's hard enough to preach a good sermon, harder still to preach a sermon that will do any good. And my guess is that's especially true with the book of Ecclesiastes, which perhaps I unwisely chose as our basis of sermons for this month. But still, I have to ask you, did our lesson last week do you any good? And specifically, you don't have to give a show of hands, but did you do your homework? Did you try at least 3 times a day to put your eyes on eternity and to sort of bring your life back into focus by thinking about your day in the light of eternity? If not, do we need to hold you back a year in school while the rest of us are going to move forward? So, Oh, I went the wrong direction. There we go. So, life under the sun. That's a phrase that's used almost 30 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And one point I think worth making again this week is how much life imagined and described in the book of Ecclesiastes matches and fits with our life today. I mean, that book was written 3,000 years ago, and it could just be as current as today. And to illustrate that, I'm going to take you for a moment to the wisdom of the greatest music of the last 60 years, which of course is classic rock of the 1960s and 70s, as I'm sure you're all aware. And so, for example, take the Rolling Stones, I Can't Get No Satisfaction. And just like the author of Ecclesiastes, he tried and he tried and he tried and he tried, but he still couldn't get no satisfaction. I mean, that's right out of Ecclesiastes chapters 1 and 2. Or, I like this one, Mr. Big Stuff, who do you think you are with your fancy clothes and your big fine car? Another good theme from the book of Ecclesiastes. Or the Beatles, he's a real nowhere man, sitting in his nowhere land, making all his nowhere plans for nobody. Again, the book of Ecclesiastes. Or one of my favorites from Hibbing, Minnesota, Bob Dylan, how does it feel to be without a home, like a complete unknown, just like a rolling stone? So that's life as this great music would show us in our current times. And just to kind of underscore how much this is like the book of Ecclesiastes, life under the sun in Ecclesiastes, I think is just like the message of these songs. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 11, when I surveyed all that I had toiled to achieve, it was like a chasing after the wind, just like a rolling stone. Chapter 1 verse 11, no one remembers the former generations. There is no legacy. There's no lasting value that you're leaving on this earth that people are going to remember. Ecclesiastes 2, verses 18 to 23. What good is all your toil under the sun? As I mentioned last week, that's almost the theme question of the book of Ecclesiastes. What good is all of our toil under the sun? And as I mentioned, the short answer is not very much. But he goes on to say here in Ecclesiastes 2, 18 to 23, what does all your toil under the sun mean? Well, your days are filled with grief and pain, and he says, even at night your minds do not rest. Surely you can relate to that. The pain and toil and the difficulty of work and the difficulty sometimes of getting to sleep at night because our work is still on our minds. Ecclesiastes 1, verses 4 through 10, all the earth and all of our own lives, he doesn't use this phrase, but the modern phrase would be they're on rinse and repeat. The sea goes out and the water comes back in. And the sun comes up, and at the end of the day it goes down, and guess what? The next day the sun comes up again. And then he goes to our own lives and our own bodies and how our minds think and spin in the same cycle, and our breath comes in the same cycle. And so this is what life is like according to the writer of Ecclesiastes. Paul, I think, had a really good illustration of this. Paul said in Romans 8:22, and from this picture, I wonder, is this very much like the climate change that we're experiencing today? We know that the whole creation, Paul writes in Romans 8:22, has been groaning. Creation is groaning. The world is groaning, Paul says, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. So Paul has the same understanding of the world as the writer of Ecclesiastes, as Bob Dylan, as Mick Jagger. It's a pretty tough place to go. It's a pretty tough place to live. So what we suggested last week, just by way of quick reminder, is that our problem, at least in my view, is nearsightedness. We're looking too close to the front of the car. We're looking at today's jobs. We're looking at today's to-do list. We're looking at today's problems and challenges. But we learned, if you can remember in driver's education, that even to drive the car, you have to be looking in the long view. You have to be taking the long view and looking out ahead to even make your car steer properly in the short term. And so we challenged last week to put our eyes on eternity and let putting our eyes on eternity work back into the way we're driving the car every day. That's the challenge that I left you with last week, and that I hope you're thinking about and working on. But there's something else out there besides eternity. If you start looking out to the long view, you're going to see something else besides eternity. And just short of eternity, what you're going to see is of course, death itself. That's the bad news for today. Mark, one of the singers behind stage, he said before we came out, he said, okay, last week it was all meaningless. This week it's death. I mean, is this going to turn up pretty soon? If not, I'm out of here. I said, well, you got to come back next week and find out, But we might even have some good news about death. And that is Ecclesiastes, although, oh, good. Okay, we're back. Ecclesiastes talks constantly about the reality of death. And I'm going to spare you all of the verses, but here are 2 or 3 examples. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 16, like the fool, the wise too must die. So even though you seek wisdom, which is one of the pieces of advice in Ecclesiastes, it's not going to change the ultimate outcome. You are also going to die, he says. Chapter 3 and verse 20, all go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Chapter 9, verses 2 and 3, all share a common destiny. The righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the clean and the unclean, those who offer sacrifices and those who do not. The same destiny overtakes all. So the reality of death is just omnipresent in the book of Ecclesiastes. But Ecclesiastes has a shocker message about death. And this is where we want to settle in today. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 1. A good name is better than fine perfume. Well, that makes sense to us, doesn't it? I mean, fine perfume is kind of a superficial, pleasant thing, but it doesn't really last. But a good name, that might be worth pursuing. That's something that would last a little longer. But then the second half of the verse is the shocker. And one's day of death is better than one's day of birth. I mean, can you imagine that? A good name is better than fine perfume. Yeah, we can accept that. But one's day of death, the writer says, is better than one's day of birth. That's a little bit hard to accept, isn't it? And so we'll listen as the writer elaborates a little bit. He says, a good name is better than fine perfume. The day of death is better than the day of life. He goes on to say, it's better to go into the house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. Wow, that doesn't sound right. For death is the destiny of everyone. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. Verse 8, the end of the matter is better than its beginning. it occurred to me that's what you're going to think when my Ecclesiastes sermons are over. The end of the matter is better than the beginning. So here is the question of the morning. How could the day of death possibly be better, as the writer of Ecclesiastes says, than the day of our birth? Well, it could just be a possibility. It could just be the difference between potential at the day of birth and fulfillment at the day of death. I mean, when we're born, we're kind of nothing but a little blob of potential, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot there. Oh, yes, they're cute. They all are cute, and we say that. But we don't know what they're going to be. We don't know what they're going to do. We don't know what their lives are going to be like. They're just a ball of potential. I remember when our firstborn came along, and we were in bed one night and looking at her, and my wife said, "Who do you think she looks more like, you or me?" And I thought, well, she's got that kind of oversized head and just a little bit of hair, kind of, half bald, and those big eyes. And I said, well, really, she looks more like E.T. than either one of us. That was not the right thing to say. Unfortunately, I didn't realize it until it was too late. So how could death be better than the day of birth? Well, maybe that's part of what is meant here, that the day of birth is just potential, but by the day of death, we have lived a life. There's something to account for. There's some character that's been expressed and developed. There's some things that we have done. So maybe that's part of what the writer means. But the next thing I think is the most important part of this lesson this morning. I think a large part of what the writer of Ecclesiastes means is death is a better teacher. Death teaches better lessons than birth. I'd like you, if you're making notes, that's the most important note. Circles, stars, arrows, whatever you use. Death is a better teacher. Death teaches valuable and important lessons. Death really is a vantage point. It's a way of looking back and sorting out and seeing what has been really important in life. And I quoted last week Jerry West, the famous basketball player, who, if anybody has left a legacy, Jerry West has maybe left a big legacy, passed away in the last week or two. And yet, Jerry West, I watched the podcast again this week. Jerry West was asked by Clippers player Paul George, what do you want people to remember you for? And he said, I want them to remember that he was a good guy and he cared. That's it. Death has that way of giving you the right vantage point to look back at your life. And Jerry said, it's not how many baskets I made. It's not how many points I scored. It's not the fact that my picture's on the NBA logo. What I want people to remember is he was a good guy and he cared. That's what death teaches. That's the perspective that death gives back, is to ignore the baskets and the points and to realize he was a good guy and he cared. That was Jerry's version of what death was going to teach. So I want to suggest to you this morning that what we really ought to be doing, if we're wise, that's another theme in Ecclesiastes, is we need to learn to live life backwards. Since Ecclesiastes 7 verse 2, death is the destiny of everyone, and the living should take this to heart. Catch that? Since death is where we're going, the living ought to be taking that to heart and really thinking hard about it. And so we have this theme. In fact, if you looked in your bulletins again today, I'm still recommending a book about Ecclesiastes that's pictured up here. If you want to go deeper and do extra credit reading for the course, maybe make up for not doing your homework last week, you could be getting and reading a really fine book called Living Life Backwards by David Gibson. And it is a book that brought me into this study of Ecclesiastes, and which I'm also relying on more today, perhaps, than last week. Living life backwards, Gibson says in his book, is what we need to be doing. We need to be starting with death and thinking back forward to our lives from the perspective of death. Why? because, as Gibson says, death can teach you how to live. Death can teach you how to live. And so we would do well to let death operate on our desires and on our ambitions and on our attitudes and where we invest our lives. All of those things about our lives ought to be changed because we see the specter of death. And as we live our life from death backwards, we see how it is we really want to live. I don't know if you read this book, probably the best and the most popular self-help book of the last 50 years is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Also a very fine book. And Stephen Covey, in his 7 habits, one of his most important habits is to begin with the end in mind. Same principle, living life backwards. And as Covey says, we tend to live our lives forward. We tend to get through the day. We tend to get through the week. We tend to plan things from where we are. Once in a while, we plan things backwards. Like we'll be going somewhere or we'll be making 2 or 3 stops on our way somewhere. And how will we figure out how to do that? Well, we'll start with the end in mind. We know we need to get to church by 10 o'clock. So working backwards, we need to leave by a certain time. I need to be in the shower by a certain time. We kind of start from the end and we work our way back. Or if we're planning a vacation, we realize we need to be home by Sunday, and so we need to leave there by Saturday, and so we work our way back. We know how to do that in some small things. But what Ecclesiastes is suggesting, and Stephen Covey is suggesting in this book, is we need to learn to live our whole lives that way, to see where the end is going to be and to work our way back from the end. And Covey in this book imagines a scene, I think very much like Ecclesiastes. He imagines a scene where some friends are sitting around the funeral home because of the death of one of their good friends. And as Covey listens into the conversation, he says, what are the friends saying about their deceased buddy? They're not saying how many real estate sales he made. They're not saying how many baskets he scored in life. What they're saying is, he was a really good guy. And he cared. And he was really committed to his family. And he was really involved with his church. And those were and he was a spiritual guy who really cared about other people. Those are the things the friends are saying at the funeral. Not how many baskets he scored, not how many stocks he traded, not how many real estate deals he was able to do. And so occasionally, it seems to me, we need to take that view, more than occasionally, regularly, that we look out with the end in mind and we work our way back from the perspective of death. Stephen Covey says, by the way, before he leaves this chapter, what you ought to be doing is writing your own personal mission statement in light of death. Here's what I want people to say about me at my funeral. And so here's how I'm going to have to live my life if people are going to say that. Isn't that an interesting idea? Write your own personal mission statement based on what you want people to say about you at your funeral, and then figure out how you can live your life in such a way that that's what people will say. One of the points that death also helps us see more clearly is, and I talked about this in a sermon here a couple of months ago, it reminds us that we are just passing through this life. And that's a really important perspective as well. Abraham, by faith, he made his home like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations. Hebrews 11:9 and 10. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 12, for we are foreigners and exiles. We are pilgrims in this world. Death helps us to see that we're just passing through. John 17 and 16, we are not of this world. We are living in this world for a time, but thanks to death, we're not really of this world. Or Romans 12 and verse 2, be not conformed to this world. So hopefully you get the point. We're just a book checked out of the library, and there is a due date. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to think about it. But but there's a due date on our lives. And that becomes, if we'll accept that and look from that perspective, that becomes a great teacher about how we should live our lives. Of course, you and I are fortunate to have a perspective that perhaps the writer of Ecclesiastes couldn't have had, and that is to have the perspective of Christ. We live in the time of Christ, where looking death square in the face is even more attractive than the writer of Ecclesiastes could have expressed. And so the Apostle Paul, even from prison, put it this way: "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Philippians chapter 1, verse 21. Great consistency between what Paul is teaching and what Ecclesiastes is teaching. For me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. And so the challenge that I want to leave you with this week is to see if you can start living life backwards, to start at death and allow death to teach us, to accept that death is a teacher. And what will we learn from death? Well, what we'll learn is whatever we want said of us at our funerals and on our tombstones, that's the life we're going to have to live starting today. Let's all stand together then for our final song.